Ships, man's oldest form of transport. Ships make all men neighbors. The rusting tramps and splendid liners that bear the products of the world's millions of laboring people. Australia is largely dependent on the export of her fine wool, and the ships which bear it, the men who sail them and load them, forge a link in a vital chain. From the labors of the men who till the soil springs the plentiful grain. Grain sorely needed in Europe and Asia. From the wheat fields of the inland to the seaboard granaries, then down to the waiting ships, where the watersiders work to turn the ships around. Sweating below decks, handling the cargoes that meet the 1,001 needs of the community. Dusty cargoes, damaging to the lungs. Sulfur from the Americas, for the manufacture of chemicals, the treatment of steel, for superphosphates to make soil fertile, indispensable to industry. Acrid sulfur that burns the eyes. timber and paper from the Canadian forests, fuel and machinery, food and textiles, 38 million tons in 1 year, stowed and slung by Australia's 24,000 waterside workers. This huge volume of cargo, an increase of 10 million tons in 5 years, handled at a rate that compares favorably with any other country. Industrial storm clouds hover on the waterfront. The industry, with its reputation of turbulence, seems beset by conflict and misunderstanding. Harsh and unfounded accusations from the daily newspapers and from the government are common. Shipping interests, always well represented in Parliament, have influenced governments to pass legislation regarded by watersiders as repressive. Legislation which threatens to deprive them of hard-won conditions. Their reaction is spontaneous, and the form of their resistance the traditional one, a tradition born from struggles of the past. Rank and file discussion, rank and file decision. Why do these men take such action? Action that leaves their pay envelopes lighter and their tables short of food. To understand why, it is essential to understand the background of the industry. It is essential to know something of the bitter memories of the men who worked the waterfront's hungry miles. Memories of hardship and privation. Harsh memories of the 30s. In those days of wide unemployment, thousands of men on the waterfront battling to make an uncertain living were at the mercy of the ship owner. Methods of employment were degrading and inhuman. Lined up like so many cattle, worker was played against worker, unionist against non-unionist, and those who protested didn't get a job. You'll do, and you can fight like dogs for what's left. To keep themselves and their families from slow starvation on dole rations, men were forced to break conditions. Heavy and primitive gear, excessive hours of work often as long as 24 hours straight. Work in all weather and conditions, no protective clothing, led to strain and injury many would bear for the rest of their lives. industrial fatigue and dangerous gear caused all too many accidents. But the job went on. Men were easy to replace. The depressed days of the 30s dawned with increasing hardship, bringing unemployment never before experienced in this country. Every morning, more and more workers joined the waiting groups at the factory gates, hoping for the infrequent job. And more were thrown upon their own resources to earn a few shillings as best they may. The evicted and the destitute found shelter under rusting iron, hessian, and case timber. Women folk struggled to keep their families together, preparing meager meals in kerosene tins. The shame of dole queues in a land of plenty. Men walked the waterfront day and night, living on the infrequent job and the dole ration. Huddled over fires, they waited through the night. And as though kindled by the sparks of their fires, the old spirit was emerging, the spirit of protest. But to have the courage of one's convictions often meant the difference between eating and not eating. Profits went on. The big overseas shipping lines still counted their profits in millions. Luxury belongs to those who never lumped a bag of wheat, sweated in a sugar boat, or stowed a bale of wool. In the world, you will find human crabs that eat their kind, glutted crabs that devour all that falls within their power, crawling in gangs around these capes, poisonous, bloated, crab-like shapes. And these horrid creatures, wet with the thick, unwholesome sweat, have most hideous banquets here on a poor, drowned mariner. Waterside workers, with thousands of other jobless men, protested against the injustice of great wealth on one hand and poverty on the other in the bitter unemployed demonstrations of the 30s. On the wharves, the Times gave rise to a growing awareness. Men pulled in their belts and began to ask the reason why. For the many who suffered in silence, there emerged a band of workers who would not remain quiet, who refused to accept injustice. Through this misery was rising a new force, the men who would carry on the great militant labor tradition of Australia and give it direction and impetus never known before. But to do it, they had to fight not only the ship owners, but the ship owners' friends in Parliament. They found fighting leaders to match their fighting temper. They forced improvements, but only at the cost of many a bitter and bloody struggle. Today, the 24-hour shift is an evil memory. Victimization of the bull days no longer affronts the dignity of maritime unionists. A roster system of employment gained by the union ensures an equal share in the work available for all members. From the ranks of the Waterside workers came one of Australia's greatest trade union leaders, Jim Healy. Under Healy's leadership, it's the rank and file who make the decisions and make the union policy. Today, an important part of union policy is to encourage the creative and sporting activities of its members. Lunch hour concerts are popular.
They're leaving ship and station, they're leaving bench and boat, and pouring out from Melbourne to...
Facilities are available for every member to learn painting and drawing, music and photography, and to take part in healthy sport. And what of the industry today? Antiquated wharves and obsolete gear, which delay cargoes and add to the cost of living, are still used by wealthy shipping companies in an age of mechanization and immense profits. Congestion is serious on wharves designed for the sailing ships of 80 years ago. Surely methods unchanged for 50 years must be replaced by efficient ones in keeping with the times. In the interests of the community, the immense profits of the ship owners must be investigated. Men broken and aged in the industry deserve to be pensioned, and so-called amenities must be raised to a reasonable standard. Surely this is the decent and sensible approach. The waterfront workers know that this great and essential industry must be revised to serve the people of Australia, not the lords of the overseas shipping lines. Like all other working men who understand the spirit of Eureka, they know they must unite to guard the conditions they have won at such cost, must struggle for better ones, and must meet any attacks with courage and strength.
The members of the Wharfies film unit regarded The Hungry Miles as their most significant film, an important social document. It has been described as a documentary classic. In 1954, the Waterside Workers Federation General Secretary Jim Healy approached the filmmakers and asked if they could make a film on the union's industrial conflicts, past and present. A source of inspiration came from the recollections of veteran wharfies, as well as a pamphlet written by Sydney branch leader Tom Nelson. The Hungry Miles surveys the history of the Australian waterside industry and gives a worker's point of view of the reasons behind the industrial strife of the early 1950s. The film shows how the work of wharfies is vital to the ongoing life of Australia. The sequences of Sydney Depression life are particularly striking and have often been used as archival footage in newer productions. The film premiered to 5,000 wharfies at the Leichhardt Stadium. Jock Levy said that the rank and file liked it, and the general public, when it was shown to them, was sympathetic towards an angle of the waterside workers that they had never seen before. Through its success, the work of the film unit became more widely known, and they started getting commissions from other organisations. The Hungry Miles was shown in every branch of the union. It also went overseas, to New Zealand, Britain and Eastern Europe. It was screened at the Sydney Film Festival in 1955, where it was commended for its standard of production, and it was also awarded first prize at the 1957 Warsaw Youth Festival.
Such a landmark was Eureka Stockade 100 years ago, when diggers fought for their rights. The shearers' strike of the 1890s to defend their union. The great general strike of 1917 will never be forgotten by Australian trade unionists. 1931, miners shot down fighting for their right to work. The Rothbury killing shocked the country. When waterside workers stood against fascist aggression, and when they stood by the Indonesian people's fight for peace and independence, the force of Australian labour events was felt in other parts of the world. These are landmarks in labour history. November 1954. From the constant struggle, suddenly a new landmark emerged. It was the victory of the Waterside Workers Federation and the whole labour movement over the ship owners and the Menzies government. Jim Healy, Secretary of the Waterside Workers Federation.
In 1954, the overseas and Australian shipping companies secretly got together with the Menzies government.
Proof of this conspiracy is contained in this letter from an overseas shipping company to its Australian representative. The object of the conspiracy was clear. They planned to isolate the Federation from the rest of the trade unions, deprive it of public sympathy, and finally, to smash the Federation. The idea was to deal with the unions one by one and to make a start on one of the most active and successful.
What was it made the owners think this was a good time to attack our union?
Well, now,
Their plan was to attack the union by trying to deprive it of one of its most cherished rights, held since 1876. The right to recruit the labour to the waterfront industry, a right held by all maritime unions. At this time, 1953-54, Australia's trade position was very unstable. Short-lived booms were always followed by slumps and unemployment on the waterfront. This state of affairs just suited the ship owners' schemes, and they made their first move when they demanded that the union bring more men into the industry. More men, when there was little enough work as things stood. The union knew if ship owners had their way, they'd flood the waterfront with surplus labor. They knew that if this happened, the next slump would cause great unemployment on the waterfront. In defense of their members' livelihood, some branches of the union opposed the ship owners' demand.
Wrongly believing that the position of the union was weak, the shipping companies and the government thought they saw their chance. A chance to gain the support of other trade unions and to begin their planned attack on the wharfies.
The conspiracy began to unfold with a report to the Prime Minister from the AOTA, an organization dominated by the ship owners. This report demanded that the long-established right of the union to recruit labor to the industry be taken from it and instead handed to the ship owners. The ship owners' friends in Parliament, people like Osborne, Wentworth, Gullett and Opperman, supported by Bland, Secretary to the Department of Labour, knew what they had to do. They pressed for the ship owners' demands to be made law. Let's make it nice and legal, they said, and set the wheels in motion. Now, wharfies have long memories, and they haven't forgotten the abuse and victimization when the ship owners controlled the labor once before. They haven't forgotten the vicious bull system of employment. So from shipside meetings like this one, all over Australia, came unanimous support for the union's decision to fight any attempt to bring that system back, or anything like it. But would they fight alone, as the ship owners and government planned? A great deal depended on the decision of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, when the Waterside Workers leaders met with Mr. Albert Monk and other representatives to consider this threat to the union's rights. The Council of Trade Unions represents a lot of Australian workers. 150,000 iron workers and other metal trade workers. 120,000 transport workers. 4,000 seamen. 25,000 miners. 130,000 building workers, and thousands more. A total of over 1 million. The government must have got a nasty shock when, instead of the unions being divided, the council saw through their schemes, saw that the attack on the watersiders was an attack on the whole labour movement, saw that every other union was in danger. The ACTU stood with the waterside workers and condemned the government's plans. A setback for the ship owners, but they didn't give up. They used their influence in Canberra to force the bill through Parliament. The waterside workers lost no time either. They sent their own deputations to Parliament House. The two main working-class political parties, representing over half the voters in Australia, came out wholeheartedly against the bill and supported the waterside workers' cause. The Communist Party saw that Australian democratic rights were in danger unless this attack on the unions was defeated. They called on all workers to defend those rights. To the very last, the Labour Party warned the Menzies government of the serious consequences if the bill was made law. The leader of the party, Dr. Evatt, said in Parliament that the legislation was a disgraceful attempt by the monopolies to further their own wretched interests, was unjust and wrong in principle, and was bound to provoke disputes not only on the waterfront, but throughout the whole of the working unions in Australia. But the government refused to listen. They brushed aside the warnings. The Union's Federal Council took the only course of action that now remained to defend its members' rights. They called out the men. 8 a.m. November the 4th, every seaport in Australia stopped work in protest against the bill. From Adelaide to Darwin, from Darwin to Sydney, Sydney to Fremantle, on the 52 waterfronts, all was quiet. But at the union centres in every port was beginning one of the most determined campaigns in the history of the trade unions. Wharfies came in their thousands, ready to lend a hand. Committees were needed, finance, publicity, and welfare committees. For every man needed, 100 volunteered. Wharfies' wives, always playing their part on the home front, battling to make ends meet, responded magnificently. They formed committees and worked alongside their menfolk, attending to the 1,001 needs. The publicity group got busy. There was a job for everyone, and old political differences were forgotten as everyone worked together, planning a drive that would extend to every part of the country and every section of the people. Speakers went to the powerhouses, to the abattoirs, to the loco shops, and to the factories, great and small. And they told the other workers about the conspiracy and how their unions and conditions were in danger too. Perhaps some of the men they spoke to were remembering how the wharfies had always played their part in the 1,001 labour struggles of the past, how they've always stood resolute against any kind of oppression, their vigorous campaigns for peace in the world and a fair go for the working people. Everywhere they went, something was happening, something was growing, slowly at first, but becoming stronger. A great feeling of loyalty and solidarity. From many seaports, wharfies went to the country districts and put their point of view to the workers on the land. In the city, they marched on the newspaper offices and demanded to be heard. They spoke at public meetings. They broadcast from radio stations. They used every means they knew to put their case before the people. They designed and printed thousands of leaflets and handed them out to the workers in the industries and to the people in the streets. And in the cities, the wharfies made sure that the people were able to judge for themselves. Wharfies went down to the ships to put their case to the seamen and found the wharves locked against them. But they found a way, and they spoke in many languages to seamen from all over the world. We're on strike to prevent the government and the ship owners from smashing our union. Be on guard against lies in the newspapers. Hear our side of the case. Here, as in the cities and in the country, they found the same feeling, growing stronger and stronger now, a great feeling of solidarity and unity. The other workers clearly saw that unless this struggle was won, the way would be open for more attacks on their democratic liberties. Ordinary, decent people everywhere rallied to defend the Waterside workers. Their record in the many labor struggles of the past, their resolute stands for peace and a fair deal for the working people, were remembered. Went round all over the country, and gifts of money and food and pledges of support from everywhere kept the committees busy. Market agents gave tons of vegetables. Workers in dozens of industries sent their hard-earned cash. White Bay powerhouse employees gave financial support. Seamen gave outstanding support. Miners sent many hundreds of pounds. Painters and dockers in 2 shipyards offered 10 shillings from every man every week until the strike should end. From all over Australia, north and south, east and west, the working folk opened their hearts and their purses. Hundreds of telegrams set the lines humming. North Coast Labour Council have protested to Prime Minister. Maritime Meat Union, we pledge our full support. Brisbane Tramway Union, full support. Victorian Builders Union, we're with you, wharfies. Canadian West Coast Seamen's Union, Free Trade Unions Germany, solid support in your just fight. Queensland Boilermakers pledge full support for the Watersiders. Queensland Cane Cutters, you can count on us, mates. From seamen on scores of ships, the Enfield, Tory, Taloo, Iron Yampi, Iron Prince, Bulwarra, Karkula, Waitomo, Wanganella, and still they came from all over Australia. Yes, everywhere, decent, ordinary people stand up for trade union rights and liberties. On November the 8th, the bill was hurriedly signed and sealed.
Now, the law of the land is no light matter. Once a law is passed, the full powers of the state may be used to enforce it. But there are good laws and there are bad laws. More than 1 million Australian workers had decided this was a bad law and an unjust law, because it was inspired not by the public welfare, but by the ship owners in their own selfish interests. And the country knew that this was so.
It was the next meeting of the Australian Council of Trade Unions that dealt the final blow to the conspiracy. In their historic resolution, the ACTU called on all members not to apply to the ship owners under the new conditions. Anyone who did so, they said, would be regarded as an industrial renegade. Confident that the powerful solidarity of all the workers would ensure that there were no applicants, they recommended a return to work. There were no industrial renegades. The ship owners got no applicants. The reaction of the ship owners and the government isn't hard to imagine. Unable to break the union or the men, each blamed the other. The solidarity of all the workers had made a bad law unworkable. So it was back to work. The big conspiracy was exposed and defeated, and the union established its rights. The Watersiders recruit the labor as before. When workers fight together, it always works out this way, and it always will. In this case, the whole labor movement had stood united. Yes, the old story. United we stood, and the victory was won.
November Victory was made in 1955. In collaboration with commercial shipping interests, the Menzies federal government proposed changes to the stevedoring industry bill. They tried to stop the union having the right to recruit waterside labour. Work on all 52 wharves in Australia stopped for 12 days in November of 1954. In fighting against the new bill, the union launched a massive information campaign with leaflets, factory and worksite talks and radio broadcasts, and they commissioned the unit to make this film. The film notes important landmarks in Australian labour history: the 1917 general strike, the Rothbury killings of 1932, and the 1938 pig iron strikes. The film then shows the worksite meetings, deputations, and other types of union publicity that explain the reasons behind the current strike. The industrial action ended in a victory for the Federation and for the Australian labour movement.
The gateway to a great city. A peaceful city, shining in the sun. Its waters flash and sparkle like hard glass. A peaceful scene, but behind the quiet facade is the stir of power and the turbulence of motion. This is a seaport, a throbbing artery through which flows the lifeblood of the nation. Here, ships from the 7 seas and the 4 corners of the earth discharge their silks and steels. Here men labor and sweat to feed the hunger of the city. Coal for the furnace, coal for the foundry, coal for the active muscle of the city, the powerhouse. Food for the city, timber, machinery, steel and concrete for the growing spires of the city skyline. These are the men who bring life to the city. These are the men who turn the ships around. Australia's wealth, flowing through the port. Flour for the bread of Europe, flour for the bread of Asia. Here you have to be strong and nimble. This is a dangerous occupation. 12,000 men are injured every year, 1/2 of the total labour force. This is a young man's job, yet old men are at work here. 1,500 Federation members are over the age of 60. These are the veterans of the waterfront. These men have laboured here for 30, 40, and some as long as 50 years. lives moulded on the waterfront, lifting, lumping and heaving for the needs of the city. Walk, walk, walk. Keep on walking, old man. Leave your job, and where will you walk to? Where will you go? What awaits you in the city you have served so long and so well? Infested tenement rooms to rot out your last days. Charity on a sick bed. Aimless wandering, not knowing where your next decent meal is coming from. What awaits you, old man, but misery? The veterans work on while they have the strength, in preference to a life of poverty. From the sum of their labour, shipping companies have been paying high dividends. In 1 year alone, 5 companies made £40 million profit, dividends kept high by sweat and ill health. In 1945, the government medical officer, Dr. McQueen, investigated the health of the wharfies. This is what he found. Blood pressure. Blood pressure, when normal, is equivalent to 140 millimeters. A large proportion of the men in the industry were over 200 millimeters. In any other industry, these men would be candidates for the industrial scrap heap. I can say without hesitation that there is no other industry that can produce the number of physical derelicts that I have encountered on the waterfront. This is the price of profit. Diseases of the lung are abundant. Working in confined spaces, handling dangerous and dusty cargoes, long hours, inadequate diet, have all contributed to the high incidence of these diseases. Men who, in the main, have been ruined physically by the anxiety of the Depression years. The endless search for the infrequent job had taken its devastating toll. In the port of Sydney, a recent X-ray survey revealed 40 positive cases of tuberculosis. Hundreds of cases of other lung diseases were also detected. This is the price of profit. Hernia, a condition caused by lifting excessive weights. These men who were compelled to work at a feverish rate have paid a shocking price in premature old age and physical calamity. This is the price of profit. In the days before the war, men worked 24 hours straight, 3 days in one, and you kept the hook moving, throwing up lead at 100 tons per hour, sugar at 80 tons an hour, loading wool at 1,800 bales a shift. This is how the millions were made. This is how the profits were born. 1 a.m. The city sleeps, but the wharves are awake, and still the lifeblood of the city pulses on through the waterfront. In this grimly remembered era, known as the Bull Days, systematic sweating by the ship owners took heavy toll of the waterside workers. The Depression years, the 13-mile waterfront, men tramping the hungry miles day after day, searching for jobs, desperate for work. You had to be tough to survive the Bull Days. Every sunrise saw another nail in your coffin. Waterside Workers Federation takes action. All over the waterfront, job meetings are held. These older men must not be thrown on the industrial scrap heap. They must be allowed to enjoy the fruits of their labour. A delegation to Canberra. From the rank and file they come to take their demands to the federal government. Federation leaders Tom Nelson, Jim Healy, Dutchy Young and others head the deputation to inform parliamentarians of the Federation's objectives. The proposals are to be placed before the Minister for Labour. fund to finance the payment of pensions for men who wish to retire on reaching the age of 65. The fund to be financed from a levy on employers, either by cargo handled or hours worked. A worker is eligible for an £8 per week pension after 20 years in the industry and on reaching the age of 65. We, the veterans of the Waterside Workers Federation, resolve to carry on the fight until the demands for a pension are met. The rank and file of the Waterside Workers Federation moves into action. Men who work the ships from White Bay to Woolloomooloo are massed here to endorse the delegation's report. The campaign gains momentum. Sydney's 6,000 wharfies are with the veterans to a man. All ports, 20,000 strong, are with the veterans. The right to industrial pensions is the right of every working man. The young men of today are the veterans of tomorrow. These veterans do not ask for grudging charity, nor do they want the grinding toil of the war. They only ask for their just rights, a peaceful place in the sun. Surely it is the nation's responsibility to see that these men spend their remaining years with decency and dignity. They have served the community long and well. The nation owes them a debt. It is for you to see that that debt is paid.
In 1953, one of the union's campaigns was to achieve pensions for waterside veterans, many of whom had been on the wharves all their working lives. The union had a long history of battles to improve working conditions. Tom Nelson was a secretary of the Sydney branch and asked Jock Levy if he could make a short film about the pension campaign. At a stop work meeting, a proposal for the film to be made was approved by the rank and file. Jock Levy and Keith Gow received wharfies' wages while working on the film, and afterwards they went back to their labouring work on the waterfront. Norman Disher worked on the film on a voluntary basis. Pensions for Veterans explains the situation from the perspective of workers and concentrates on showing older unionists at work. One wharfie recalled that when the filmmakers were working with the wharfies who were the film's extras, the direction they would give would be to play it as it was. The film had its first large-scale screening to thousands of wharfies at a stop work meeting in the Leichhardt Stadium on Melbourne Cup Day in 1953. It was a long battle to achieve pensions, which were gained at last in 1967.
Inflation, caused by the policy of the Menzies government, has more than doubled the cost of living. Prices and profits rise unchecked. In 1953, Australian and overseas shipping companies alone disclosed profits of more than £53 million, but wages and margins stay frozen. Their patience exhausted, Waterside workers throughout Australia strike for wage justice. Sydney's Town Hall cannot hold the thousands that flock to the public meeting called by the Sydney branch to place the facts of the dispute before the public. Mr. Monk, ACTU President, was greeted with applause by one of the largest meetings ever held in the Sydney Town Hall when he reported that the Council of Trade Unions endorsed the action of the Waterside Workers Federation. Mr. Eddie Ward, Labor Member of Parliament, supports the wharfies case. He assured the meeting that the Labor Party would fight for wage justice for the trade unions and that this struggle in particular would receive their full support. Mr. Jim Healy, National Secretary of the Waterside Workers Federation, replied to press charges that the strike was an attempt to smash the arbitration court. He pointed out that the tyrannical attitude of the arbitration system would bring about its own destruction. Mr. Healy said that the strong support from the entire trade union movement clearly showed the justice of the wharfies' claims. Matt Munro, Vigilance Officer of the Sydney branch, puts the union's case, explains that a breakthrough by the Watersiders on the wage front will make it easier for all other workers, iron workers, railmen, members of the Australian Workers Union, and thousands more to win urgently needed wage adjustments. At the Dowling Street depot, a meeting of tramway men resolved to support the strike after hearing Alan Doherty outline the union's case. Trammies at this depot weighed in 32 pounds to the strike fund. St. Mary's, listening to well-known wharfie speaker Stan Moran, are employees of the American Utah Construction Company. Here the Menzies government is building a £23 million munitions factory. Shift workers coming and going eagerly sought and read the leaflets handed out for the wharfies. Jack Hartley, another of the many wharfie speakers in this well-planned publicity drive, essential part of the strike campaign to put the real facts before the people. At Port Kembla, publicity again takes high priority in the growing campaign. On the railway platforms at the heavy industry shift change, Secretary Bill Harkness and Strike Committee man Jack Wool speak to hundreds of steelworkers. Despite the rain, speakers held a record number of meetings. A unique sidelight from Port Kembla branch. At Wollongong, in one of the biggest mass contributions ever organised by the Red Cross, members of this branch became blood donors and did their bit for a worthy cause. There were many volunteers and a roster system had to be worked out to fit them all in. This blood will later be grouped and will become a valuable asset in the Red Cross blood bank. Strikers' wives hear reports from other members of the miners, and many others had promised to give their moral and financial backing and to lend their weight to the strikers' demand for wage. High-pressure work involving 8 committees keeps the members busy. Strike committee, publicity, ticket, welfare, entertainment, finance and women's committees. Despite ship owners' determined attempts to discredit the Watersiders, public response to their cause was generous and practical. They gave donations of money and food to see to the immediate needs of the strikers and their families. In Melbourne, as in all other ports, the womenfolk played an important part, especially in this welfare work, and stood alongside their menfolk every day of the strike. Faced every week with growing bills and a shrinking pay packet, the wharfies' wives know full well the justice of the union's claims. They saw there was a job to be done, and they did it. sidelight from Melbourne branch. In Realist Theatre, members of the branch formed themselves into a group, learnt how to screen films and showed the films made by their own union to more than 8,000 people during the strike, an important part of the publicity drive. Newcastle Watersiders turned their hand to butchering meat for the members. This meat was donated and sold to the committee at cost price by local butchers. Continuous and increasing support from the public made it possible for the Newcastle branch to give particular attention to the welfare needs of its members. The Women's Committee is well to the fore again, showing their growing awareness and practical assistance in trade union activity. Like every other housewife, wharfies' wives have been hard hit by high prices and frozen wages. They come to help because they are convinced that the struggle their men are involved in is a just one. Helping to decide policy in the Welfare Committee, the Newcastle women give Bernie Sullivan some good advice on food allocation. These experiences of the Women Folk in Strike organisation will serve the union well in future struggles.
With the full support and best wishes of the Barbers' Union, versatile members of the Sydney branch set up shop in the union rooms and got busy with scissors and clippers. No casualties were reported, and this customer seems well pleased with the result. The large Sydney Welfare Committee, led by Vice Presidents Norm Woodley and Communist Alderman Ron Maxwell, discussed ways to relieve the financial worries of the members. This group interviewed gas companies, electricity authorities and hire purchase firms, asked for temporary concessions and were successful in obtaining them. Members came in from all suburbs of Sydney on Fridays, distribution day for the Welfare Committee. Care was taken to see that the food allocation contained a good balance of food requirements. Dozens of Women's Committee members helped give out fruit, vegetables, butter, sugar, eggs, tea and cereals. As the strike developed, welfare groups appeared in the suburbs, rallied behind the Waterside workers and generously assisted this important welfare work.
Here's Neville Isaacson of the Publicity Committee explain the issues. Crowded meetings like this one, bringing full support from the entire trade union movement, were the result of the union's impressive campaigns in all branches. Hundreds of rank and file speakers addressed scores of meetings every day of the strike. This tremendous activity, with its great unity and enthusiasm, brought the struggle close to victory. Then suddenly, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, which had pledged full support for the strike, withdrew its support. A decision which shocked the labour movement and was later refused endorsement by the trades and labour councils. The Waterside Workers Federal Council met and unanimously rejected the ACTU proposals. Mr. Healy said that these proposals meant that the ACTU had forsaken the struggle. Further, it had sacrificed the united support of the very trade unionists it claimed to represent. Representatives from all states stressed the urgent need to convince the ACTU executive of this nationwide solidarity. They emphasized their readiness to fight on and to preserve unity. But despite the protests which followed, the ACTU turned a deaf ear. Realizing the supreme need for unity, so that the struggle for wage justice could continue from a position of strength, the Federal Council of the Union recommended a return to work. Mass meetings were called in all states to discuss the recommendation. Typical of the meetings held in an atmosphere of democratic debate was the Melbourne branch meeting addressed by councillors Curly Rook and Ted Bull, where members unanimously decided to return to work. Remains the spearhead of the campaign for all other workers and is still supported by the trade union movement. The future of wage justice is dependent on courage, unity and action. The support of the Australian Council of Trade Unions must be added to this. And in this spirit, workers face the future struggle for higher margins and better all-round conditions on the Australian waterfront.
In the post-war period, newsreels were popular in cinemas. While commercial newsreels showed things like the royal visit and the Red X car trial, the film unit made an episode of their own newsreel on the 1956 margins dispute, a campaign to put the real facts before the people. In their combi van, the film unit went out from the Sydney branch to the suburbs, to Newcastle, Wollongong and Port Kembla, and then down to Melbourne. They travelled to film union events and also to talk with workers, teach them how to be projectionists and to screen their other films.